Do you remember how it was like for you to do the multiplications table? I've been working with my oldest kids on this, like what's 5 times 5, what's 9 times 6, and when they first started doing this, it was very difficult for them. But now they can say, oh, Mom, that's easy, I know that one. And it's the same with you when you're starting with a new type of literature. It can be challenging at first because there's new things to learn, but once you've done it over several times, then it becomes easier. But in a way, even though you're starting a new type of literature, you're already ahead of the game because you've already been practicing the inductive method over and over and over. So it's much easier for you than from starting back with Philemon. So there are a couple new things that you have to learn, like the oracles and certain things with the prophets, but you're already on your start. So be patient with yourself and give yourself time to learn this new type of literature, and then it will become easier with practice. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at some specific interpretations and observation helps with the prophets, and this also includes understanding how to identify the 3 main types of oracles in prophetic literature. So we're going to start out with looking at observation and interpretation helps, and this material that I'm going to go over with different tips is on your handout, which is called Tips for Interpreting the Prophets, but it also includes observation. Okay, tip number 1. Consider the historical situation. The world in which the nations of Israel and Judah existed was a time of political and social upheaval. We see where Israel and Judah were most often unfaithful to God. There was a lot of idolatry. There was great disregard for the covenant, and it was during this time period that God rose up the prophets to speak into his people's lives and to call them back to the covenant. Your assignment, which you did for 1st and 2nd Kings, will actually help you with the prophetic books, because most of the prophetic books tell you which kings were reigning during the time period of that particular prophet, and so you can go back to those different kings from your king's assignment and see what was happening politically, morally, socially, politically in that time period of those specific kings. And it also will help you to look what was going on with the nations around them. What battles were they a part of? What was their main enemy at that time? Was it Assyria or was it Babylon? And so on. So also your prophet BRI, which is a little bit different than the historical or the Hebrew poetry or wisdom literature BRI. And so here are some important questions that will help you to understand the historical situation. Like, when was the book written? Who are the original hearers? What was the political situation, Judah, Israel, or the surrounding nations? What was the religious situation in Israel, Judah, or the surrounding nations? Which kings were reigning at the time of Judah or Israel? What other prophets were speaking in Israel or Judah? Or what particular purpose was it for the writing of this book? Tip number 2, consider the literary forms. And so we're going to go over just briefly some things to remember that you've already had or we've already talked about, but these are some important things to think about as you are charting through the prophets. Number 1, remember poetry and Hebrew parallelisms, because the majority of the prophets are written in poetry. So you need to clearly be able to understand and see the different types of Hebrew parallelism. So remember the Hebrew parallelism lecture you just had with Phil Leach. Also, oracles. The prophets used some varied literary forms to show their prophetic messages, which are called oracles. So it's important to be able to observe the different oracles in order to help you with your interpretation. The most common three most common forms of prophetic oracles is the lawsuit, the woe oracle, and the promise or salvation oracle, which is also sometimes called the messianic oracles. But we'll talk about these oracles more specifically later on in this lecture. And also another literary form was enacted symbols. We've already talked about this. But also look at the historical narrative. Even though the majority of the prophets is written in poetry, you also have historical narratives. For example, if we look in Isaiah, hopefully your Bible has this. The calling of Isaiah in chapter 6. I know you can't read the text, but if you see how it's mostly historical if it goes from the margins. But if you see where it's indented in the margins, then that is poetry. So with Isaiah's call, the first part of the chapter would be considered historical narrative, except for this verse 3. And then the end of it would be more poetry. So it's important that you're aware of that. Also, there are laments in the prophets. Laments are where they are sorrowful, they're mourning. You even have a whole book of laments, which is called Lamentations. Apocalyptic literature. This is primarily in the book of Daniel and part of Ezekiel and Zechariah. So remember about apocalyptic literature when you did Revelations, and you'll get more information about it when you start Daniel. Figures of speech, also very important, because with most other poetry language, they use a lot of figures of speech. And so the reason why the prophets used figures of speech was to help the original reader, the original audience, to get word pictures in their mind and images that would help them better remember the message. And so I've included a handout for you, which is on the website, just to review the figures of speech. And I just want to talk about two briefly. I mean, there's a lot that you will see. You will see symbolisms, metaphors, irony, personification, and those kind of things in the prophets. But you also see a couple of types. A type is a prefigure something or someone to come. And so you see a lot of types from the Old Testament, which are types in the New Testament. For example, the Passover lamb was a type of Jesus as a sacrificial lamb. John the Baptist is a type of Elijah, and so on. But they're explained, these types are explained in the New Testament. Symbols. You also sometimes have symbols, which is something that stands for another meaning in addition to the original meaning. For example, in Daniel, in chapter 8, you have a ram which has two horns, and the author, or Daniel, as he's prophesying, clearly interprets these symbols to mean Media and Persia. So it's important, just as you did in Revelations, that it's important to see what does the symbols mean. Does the author himself interpret them or not, before you try to figure out what they are on your own. Okay, now let's look at tip number 3. Understand the use of figurative language. Again, prophetic literature, like other biblical poetry, is very rich in figurative language. So understanding figurative language is important in understanding poetic literature for good interpretation. So it's important to be able to understand figures of speech and try to picture in your mind the word picture that the prophet's trying to say, to bring to the people, to help them understand this. Okay? Tip number 4, consider the context. This is very important. And so you have to consider both the historical and the literary context before interpreting a passage or verse. The historical context is understanding what is going on during the time of that prophet. What is going on in Judah or Israel? What also is going on politically with the major world powers during that time? Was Judah being in the influence of Babylon, or was Israel, the nation of Israel, being affected by Assyria? And and wanting to seek help from Assyria instead of seeking help from God, and so on. So again, your king's assignment can help you in this. And there's also another general handout about some of the major world powers, which is included under the lecture about the prophetic literature. So the other thing you need to consider is the literary context. Words, sentences, and paragraphs have no meaning apart from their specific context. So meaning comes when words, sentences, and paragraphs have context. So when you're looking at literary context, you need to consider two things. You need to consider the context of, like, if you're looking at a word or phrase or a sentence, what is the context of it related to the paragraph before, the paragraph after? What is the big picture of your chart, of your vertical segment chart? You have to keep it in context of that. What is the context or the big picture of the book? And also, what is the context of the Bible as a whole? This helps keep us from coming to bad interpretation. And another thing, when you're looking at literary context, you also need to think about what is the type of literature. Because if you have teaching literature or teaching type passages, how you interpret that is different. You can be more literal than you can be with poetry. So think about that. Tip number 5, look for the main idea, but don't try to squeeze every word for meaning. Again, poetry, you have to look for the main idea that the prophet is describing. So when you're looking at your specific segment or vertical chart, whatever you want to call it, try to see what is the big picture of that chart. And a lot of times it should be the title that you give it. That's the big picture. So keep that in mind instead of trying to look at this specific word and what does it mean, and oh, I don't understand it, or I don't know what message. So keep that in mind. Keep also in mind the big picture of the book instead of getting caught up in all the specific details. Okay, tip 6. The New Testament interprets the Old Testament. Look for New Testament quotes for the Old Testament passages. And I've included a handout to help you with that. So it should list all of the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament. So it says, and think about, what does the New Testament say about this passage? How does the New Testament interpret it? Tip number 7, consider the Hebrew mindset. And so we're going to just briefly describe some of the major events that have happened in their history, which the prophets repeat or refer to very often. And this list of events is in your handout, which is called Tips for Interpreting the Prophets. So all of these tips that I'm giving you are on that handout. So the Hebrew mindset was formed by key events in their history. For example, creation, the fall of man, the flood. Abraham was very important to them, and then the call that God gave him. And Israel and Judah saw as their forefathers of Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes. The promise that God gave Abraham, the promise of land, of blessings, was very important to them. And also that God has specifically called the nation of Israel as His special people. The Exodus was important. The wilderness wanderings, the conquest of the promised land. The covenant blessings and curses are extremely important to their identity and who they are. David and God's promise to him of an forever kingdom. The temple, Solomon's great temple, was so important. The monarchy, the king, especially the line of David, and other Old Testament heroes like Elijah, David, Joshua, and so on. So when the prophets make reference to these key events in Israel's past or key past historical people, You need to consider the lesson or the significance of these things to the people of Israel and Judah, and what the prophet's wanting to say to the original reader and the original hearer, to help them remember back to these things, to challenge them to either change their behavior and come back to the law, or to encourage them of how God was faithful in the past and how God will be faithful to them in the future. So references to these events or people from Israel's past will become like a reference or figures for future enemies, battles, or blessings. Okay, tip number 8. All the prophet says is not predictive prophecy. We've already talked about this, but just to reiterate, not every word of the prophet is predictions. Much of what they say is the assessment of the original reader and the original hearer's present situation. And as you will find out, very often they are not following the law of God. So the prophets are challenging the original reader and the original hearer to come back to God and away from their sins. You see, the prophets have a real pastoral heart for the people and want to encourage the people to obey, but if they disobey, then there will be judgment. Okay, now with the rest of this lecture, we want to look at the 3 main oracles which are used in the prophets. Here's a quote from Fee and Stewart from the book How to Study the Bible for All It's Worth. When one comes to actual study the prophetic books, first one must